This week's Rugby Vibe is a look at the so-called minnow nations at the tournament. My intent is to help you watch more rugby over the next week and perhaps work less. You know, it's Rugby World Cups that are often characterized by 12 games that you want to watch. A pool game in each pool plus 8 knockout games. That makes 12 out of a total 48. A quarter of the tournament, maybe a third at best. This World Cup's going to be quite different, and that's because the minnows have come on in leaps and bounds. Look at this last weekend. Ireland were held by the US. Romania should have beaten Scotland. And of course the Namibians were terrific against Fiji. And it was on this show, Rugby Vibe, last week, where the Namibians got a bum rap, and I should eat humble pie for that. But what's characterized this World Cup is the quality of the minnow nations to date. So you think back to the Sri Lankan cricket team who came here to South Africa in early to mid-80s, and they were the whipping boys of all our sides. 11 years later, in 96, they won the Cricket World Cup. Now, how were they able to make such a turnaround in such a short space of time? Well, the answer is they were invited into the International Cricket Council's fixtures, and they were able to get more game time at the highest level. The intensity at the highest level is such that the more you play there, the better you get. And that does two things. It improves your national side, but it also creates a more aspirational vibe for your youngsters coming through to want to play in the national side. So think about the Italians. They were invited into what was the 5 nations for years, what then became the 6 nations, and they've improved out of sight. In fact, this last weekend, they played against Australia, and it was 6-all at half times. Yes, the Aussies buried them in the end, but that was a great Italian performance. They were a very strong defensive side as well, and that's because of the exposure. Now, what's going to happen when Argentina next year join the Tri-Nations? It becomes the 4 nations. What's the impact of that going to be on Argentinian rugby? And they already come off a very strong base. I suggested 4 or 8 years, the RG is going to be a very good chance of winning this tournament. So the first game I want to take a look at is being played this morning at 9:30, and it's America against Russia. The Americans are the 17th seeds, the Russians are the 19th seeds. It's a throwback to the Cold War, and it reminds me when Ivan Drago fought against Rocky Balboa. It's going to be an absolute cracker. The Americans are the favorites. They've won the last 2 fixtures. They've got Todd Clever, who played for the Lions, and Nguenia, who rounded Habana famously at the last World Cup in their side. The Russians have a lot of injuries. That's not going to help them. They've got Kingsley Jones, a Welshman who coached at Sale, leading them, and that's going to be a great help to Russian rugby. They boast a left wing by the name of Vasily Artemiev. He played for the Island Schoolboys and Island Universities. He's their best player. Now, they've got a checkered World Cup past, the Russians. They boycotted 87. They were banned from 2003 for hosting 3 ineligible South Africans. But that's going to be a great game today. And tomorrow, the Japanese play the New Zealanders. And for me, that's going to be a defining game for 2 reasons. Japan lost to New Zealand in the 1995 World Cup, 145 points to 17. And the game tomorrow is going to show the distance that Japanese rugby's come when they face the self-same All Blacks. I don't believe they're going to get 145 points. So what's happened to Japanese rugby since then? Well, there's been a massive foreign influence in Japanese rugby. You think about guys like Aaron Penne, Jamie Joseph, Ron Cribb, Troy Flavel, Leon MacDonald, guys like Jaco van der Vestes, and then great coaches like Eddie Jones and Wayne Smith. They've had a massive impact on Japanese rugby to date, which has really lifted the standards and improved the cherry blossoms, or the brave blossoms as the national sides called. So next week, Tuesday, there's a brilliant game that's between Italy and Russia, and that's something you want to watch because there's a big South African influence in both those sides. In the Italians, obviously, Nick Mallett coaches the side, and they've picked 3 of the 7 South Africans who are playing in the tournament but not for South Africa are in the Italian setup, and they all lock forwards. Quinton Geldenhuys, Cornelius van Zyl, and Carlo Del Fava. So you want to watch that. And they're playing against a Russian side that's had a big South African influence over the last 10 years. Jimmy Stonehouse, who now famously coaches the Pumas in the Currie Cup, and a brilliant rugby guy called Blikkies Groenewald, who's coaching Tikkies, have had a big influence on Russian rugby. So you want to watch that one for the South African influence. And then next Wednesday, also at 9:30, Tonga are playing Japan. And that's going to be a great game because Tonga are ranked 12th in the world and Japan 13th. Now, it's also the Tongans who have the 2nd biggest influence on Japanese domestic rugby over the last 15 years. And there are a few Tongans knocking about in the Japanese setup that's going to be really good. So there are 4 games for you to watch that you probably didn't know you should over the next week. And I want to leave you with a little story. The New Zealand Herald, New Zealand's premier newspaper, ran a story this morning. It was called The 10 Greatest Moments in New Zealand Rugby History. And for those of you who study the game, you won't be surprised that it wasn't the '87 World Cup win. It was in fact the win in South Africa in 1996 for New Zealand to accomplish what they called the dream, a series win in South Africa. Now that warms my heart. It was the South Africans, in fact, who had 4 of the 10 greatest moments against the Kiwis in this morning's article. That's all from me. I'm Stephen Morris. This is Rugby Vibe, brought to you by Prongster. I'll see you next week.